Here in Objective 6, we're going to be addressing how cultural issues affect the supervisory relationship. And starting at the left of the screen, we're going to hit some highlights and content here, and then we're going to elaborate on that a little bit further later on. So initially, we're looking at the person being at the center of holistic practice. We've already discussed and raised issues of therapeutic alliance, the client's freedom and encouragement to tell and reveal his story in his way, and with the necessity of actively listening to what our client has to say. Also, we're going to be looking at our level of cultural awareness and competencies to include a major portion of that awareness to be aware of our own biases and the client's biases, and ultimately superimpose the use of ourselves, i.e., the use of your intern with the client in practice.
The focus of this in the past has focused heavily on understanding cultural practices, beliefs, and worldviews of a range of groups. The art of what we're doing comes out of that therapeutic alliance that's developed and the client story, because it's the client that you're dealing with and not the group. And I think sometimes we get confused about taking into account groups, because clients sometimes may be part of groups, but they may not practice a lot of what the group cultural practices are that you may have read about. So the client story is critically important. And in this case, we're talking about supervisor and intern. So as you see in the middle here, we have the supervisor and intern, which parallels, as we look at the parallel process in a few minutes in the next objective, the client-intern relationship. But just again to reflect on subject-object relationships are where one is an expert and the client is the object of the expert's information, as opposed to being on the same level, which I call subject-subject, which comes from some of Paulo Freire's work as well as Martin Buber's work about I and thou. Here, we'll reflect on differences between cultural backgrounds between the supervisor and intern and the client population being served by the intern. And this parallel process is important because the supervision, while not therapy, sometimes demonstrates various skill sets that the intern will be using with the client, because all three are connected in some way throughout this 2-year period. Next, we will move into discussing person-centered holistic practice. And as we begin to look at this, we want to understand we're working with the beliefs and worldviews of the intern or the client that vary from the groups we associate them with.
So let's look first at the person-centered holistic practice. You'll see the arrow leading from this section up to the supervisor's initial session with the intern. And here the supervisor and intern are doing a subject-to-subject sharing, so that in welcoming the intern, you may know the intern from a prior experience, or the intern may be relatively new to you. And in so doing, you're going to invite the intern to tell his or her own brief overview of their life, starting with childhood and working up through their own story of education, training, and related experiences, so that you will leave this first session with some greater awareness of who this person is according to their own life history. And in so doing, being the supervisor, you're going to be noting their levels of competencies regarding their own practice skills. And George is going to talk a little bit more at length about the cultural awareness.
So looking at cultural awareness and competency, it's important to look at the supervisors and interns' biases, because bias has been the elephant in the room in terms of our work with this since the inception of the profession, and how to use self in practice with an awareness of biases and self-awareness encountering clients. So under cultural awareness, we want to look at what is our self-awareness. We all are biased. I think we have to come up with an admission that we're all biased. I mean, that's a fact of being human. And, what are those biases in regard to the intern or the client with whom we're working with? And what strategies can one use to reduce the effects of bias in working with clients? We talked a little bit earlier about how before sessions, either with interns or clients, we tap into our intuition to put forth an intention to have a positive outcome and to imagine the intern or client's worldview. I think if we have heard their story and we understand who they are and we understand some level of their worldview, if we have particular biases related to the intern or client, that is one way to reduce the bias because we leave it, so to speak, at the door as we enter into the session with the intern or the client. What implications does bias have for use of self in practice? So that's the critical piece here. How do you translate that into use of self in practice? One of the steps was to tap into the intuition and also to include therapeutic synchronicity as well when outcomes of therapy are affected by extra therapeutic factors that we talked about earlier. Meaningful coincidences, as an example, can go along with helping move things forward. Now, that's not directly associated with bias, but it can help with working with the client at some point, which may be associated with that in some way. And what skills, for instance, does one need to add to deliberate practice goals around this issue of improving one's awareness of culture, but also how, when you have built the therapeutic alliance and you tap into your intuition, are you able to reduce that in some way? Julie and I will now have a conversation around these two puzzle pieces in terms of the initial session, because this is really person-centered work that you're doing. And doing person-centered work in the context of your practice, but also in understanding the story that's being shared with you by the intern or the client, because it's the individual you're working with and not the group. And you'll also find that some people are parts of many different groups and may speak multiple languages. Do you have anything to kind of offer or ideas about this, Julia?
I do think that as the intern, and in our dialogue, normally I play the part of the intern because I'm the novice, and I can still see things from the experiences that many of us have had with our own students in the classroom. As George has so beautifully emphasized, it is for some of us a struggle to recognize our own biases and become more self aware in the process of learning. And of course, you and the intern will be looking at the strategies that the intern, perhaps by their own admission, perhaps by your observation, or both, will be looking at correcting or deepening as far as their knowledge base, their history of this particular cultural group, or perhaps the experience of a person associated with one cultural group who, as George referred to, this person perhaps may not adopt him or herself to that particular culture of origin, but more freely associate with one that he or she has developed as an adult. Also, the implications for bias for interns who are unaware of their own biases, I believe, impair the ability to link and to bond with a person whom they are seeing therapeutically. I believe that the limitations that the interns have on knowing their own biases can actually be barriers to bonding with clients in a therapeutic session. So the implications for biases are massive. The awareness of biases may also be massive. And the skill set that needs to be set in place or improved upon will be the challenge, I think, for the supervisor to both identify with the intern and then develop a plan of action with the intern in the setting of praxis goals and developmental practice skills.
An integral part of the therapeutic alliance has to do with setting forth or creating a safe space for discussions with the intern, which allows them to explore their biases, because bias is a way of looking at things, And to be able to have that opportunity to explore that and then find out how, in using self in practice, this is dealt with. Most of us have certain populations we prefer to work with. So that group is usually, or people in those groups probably are not the ones we're talking about. But there are a lot of us that have people, or groups of people that we prefer not to work with. Certain diagnoses may be very challenging for some of us, and that in itself is a bias that may be difficult to overcome. But if you're in a location where you're the only one standing, how do you begin to look at working with people who you have the bias with? And how do you, again, the use of self in practice is critical here. And again, practicing the understanding where the client is coming from, I think is important, because I think a lot of times, if we've ourselves had some kinds of traumas in the past that may impact our bias, we're all human and we've all had some kind of traumatic experiences, and being able to step into the world of the client's view helps us understand that not only we have traumatic experiences, but their behavior may be impacted by those previous childhood, developmental, or other traumatic experiences that may have ensued. So understanding that we're both wounded, in terms of we're wounded healers essentially, and we bring forth that in our use of self in practice, it helps us become more compassionate, perhaps, with those with whom we're working, which will lead to more positive outcomes. And see, that's part of the intention. Intending a positive outcome is 90% of getting toward working through the issues with the client, or setting the bias aside as you're doing that. Okay.
Now we're going to move into another discussion piece, which is the cultural praxis and biases, by looking at the initial groupings that we shared with you earlier, and then about examining some questions that you will probably want to investigate on your own, separate and apart from this course attendance. George, would you like to make a few comments about these questions here?
Right. We have the groups here that we all have studied and are aware of. And some of us are less aware of some groups than others, because most of the time our practices are focused within a certain range of groups as opposed to everything that's listed there, perhaps. Although I really think that spirituality is an important part of people's lives, and something we've left out a lot of the time in our work with them, which sometimes may equal about half or more of the client's experience. So when we're looking here, we were looking at the individual in the previous slide in terms of what biases do you have. But your biases come from some kinds of experiences you've had or stories you've been told by others. So beginning to explore, what are the main biases? Are you working with people now that there are biases that are arising within you that you're noticing? Maybe listing those would be helpful in beginning to look at how you might approach this in terms of your work and use of self in your practice. And then, what are your beliefs and feelings around these particular areas? And where do these beliefs and feelings come from as well? Certain needs we have, when they're not being met, when we've had some sort of traumatic experience, would definitely have elements of bringing forth some sort of bias against some way we've been treated, or certain figures, like we may have issues around authority figures, for instance, if we've had very punishing parents as children, as one example. And then how does this in the overall picture affect your practice and who you accept into your practice? If you have a choice in private practice, you have more choice with this than if you're in an agency setting. And then, when working with another with whom you have bias, how might you reduce the effects of your bias? And I think we've talked a little bit earlier about some of the things you can do with that. Particularly, I think if we try to enter into the worldview of the client, it helps us, in terms of the compassion element, understand where they might be coming from, because they may too. Now, you may work with someone in one of those groups that doesn't demonstrate any of the things of the bias you've been taught or learned about in the past or experienced. And so that's kind of also perhaps disquieting, because it's not so you're not getting what you're expecting. So that's another area to kind of explore, because individuals come from a range of backgrounds and experiences and don't necessarily behave exactly in the way in terms of the belief or worldviews of a particular group, although that may have influenced them, which is important. and what further training would be helpful to you in this area of praxis. So there are trainings in various places, CEs that you can take as well, around specific groups for perhaps better understandings of worldviews. And then again, what trauma-informed care features would you add or expand in your supervision praxis that may reduce your bias? You're already using elements of trauma-informed care. It's not like this is something new to you today, but how are those associated with perhaps reducing personal bias? Julia, again, do you have some additional thoughts on any of these as we've talked through them?
Well, a couple of particularly resonate with me. And one is the trauma informed care, of course, which we've discussed within the context of our recent cultural experiences and pandemic features that were added that exacerbate really the conditions that many people come for therapy to resolve. And so I think that is something that we'll set aside for our discussion in a bit. But the other is being aware of what types of biases you carry. And I will say from my experiences, both as a social worker, as a manager, and as a professor, I think many of us carry biases that we do not recognize and do not appreciate until we have an encounter that may border on being self-revelation or that may border on being self-informative to us. And we are stopped short to realize that was that what I just said? Or did I really mean those words? They just came out. And now I don't know how exactly I should recover. Should I say, oh, excuse me? Oh, what I meant to say was. And to me, when there is that kind of presence on the part of the therapist, the client is all too well aware of what has actually been said that they may have misinterpreted from the therapist or the intern in this case. And I think it may set up unnecessary barriers between the client and the intern or therapist that are very difficult to overcome later on. So, this whole idea of awareness, I think, is key in working with any client and in being self aware of our own presentations with them.
Before we move to the next objective, just a thought, when you're really in a process of trying to work with bias, also be open to what we call therapeutic synchronicity. In other words, do some meaningful coincidences come in to help you better deal with the particular bias area that you're concerned with? Okay, we can move to our next objective. Objective 7, accountabilities of both supervisor and intern in the supervisory relationship. Here is this parallel process I keep talking about, because when you have a supervisor and an intern, there's also the intern and client relationship, which then involves the supervisor and client as well. So in terms of relationship responsibilities, we have a triangular sort of thing going on, a triad, as we say, which we call parallel process. And so a lot of the times the supervisor is demonstrating skills for the intern, who then takes and uses those same kinds of skills with the client. And that's where we've talked about competency earlier, to go through and figure out competencies that need to be improved or added upon, and the competencies that the people have already reached the level of competence in their work. That way, as you go through the 2 years together, you continually stepwise work through improving the basic practice competencies of the intern.
Co-evolving dynamics, the intern client and the supervisor intern client relationships. On the left, you'll see that we've looked at the parallel process, and we're using the following to explain and define that process. It's to discuss explicitly with the intern patterns in the supervisor intern relationship that actually mirror patterns in the intern client relationship, or vice versa. And that was cited by Tracy, and that will appear in your bibliography if you wish to pursue that information.
And that was the image that we just saw on the first slide. And it talks about systemic concerns and this idea of isomorphism. The experience where categories with different content but similar form can be mapped on each other in such a way that there are corresponding parts and processes within each structure. When the supervisory system maps onto the therapeutic system, supervisor and intern roles correspond to those of the therapist and client reciprocity. So in this case, what we're looking at is the supervisory relationship parallels what the therapeutic relationship looks like with the client and the intern. There's similar kinds of skills and practices that one would use. So the intern in some ways is learning to be a supervisor as well as a therapist with the client, interestingly. And so that's what we'll see in the next slide, is what this isomorphism discussion looks like.
And we actually start the therapeutic and supervisory systems with these parallel appearances that we just discussed. The client with the intern, and then of course the intern with the supervisor.
And you see the initial parallel process on the bottom, and then how the isomorphism would look like that by having the intern as the link in this whole chain in the middle, because the intern works with the supervisor and then works with the client. And so there's those sorts of dynamics that go on that are material that both the client and intern and more importantly, the supervisor and intern examine about the intern's work. And this also gets to what we were talking about earlier as far as the use of self in practice again. Again, this is the opportunity in terms of these cross dynamics that are going on between the three individuals as far as the intern's use of self in practice, taking what the deliberate practice activities have been and employing them with the client. Those deliberate practice activities must take part outside of the session with the client, and so that's where the supervisor and intern do role plays perhaps for the intern to gain competence to take into the therapy session. This is very important, but also this parallels what the intern may be doing with the client, because the intern is trying to have the client develop certain competencies for themselves where they can independently function without having to return to therapy after this experience. And so in a lot of ways, the intern may be wanting to attend to what competencies they're working with the client with in order to determine if the client indeed is improving. And some of this comes about in terms of the feedback-informed treatment tools we talked about, where the client talks about at the beginning of the session how things went over the time since they last met. What did the client practice? How did things go on with the client? So that's kind of like an example of deliberate practice review for the client. And then the session rating scale at the end of the session has the client share with the intern feedback about how things connected with them. Did the intern not focus enough in one area? What was going on there? And then that material comes back to the supervisor-intern exchange and begins to develop the list of stretch goals that will be going on after the ones that are currently being developed between the intern and supervisor. So when the supervisor determines competence has been met, then beginning to go to the next levels of deliberate practice stretch goals as we've talked about them. And of course, that would continue to evolve with the client's stretch goal or deliberate practice form, like the TDPA or the one that I produced earlier. Again, do you have anything else to add perhaps to this, Julia?
I think that the following discussion is probably going to be an elaboration of these diagrams and these tables. So the application process will be elaborating on even further next.
In this section of the CE, we're going to look at the use of self in practice And as we go through here, you will find that we're overviewing a lot of what we've already discussed. So there won't be a lot of detail in some of it. But what I'd like for you to do is look at what we discuss here from the lens of how you would use this in terms of self in practice, how you would use these various kinds of things we're going to talk about. And you'll see the use of self in practice text that I showed earlier on the screen, and the heart and soul of change, delivering what works in therapy. Both are excellent books that I recommend if you want to further delve into this idea of self in practice and the common core factors, which are really critical in terms of developing that therapeutic alliance. Some of the highlights from the book had to do with looking at self-disclosure as a way to reduce transference when we're working with clients and being more transparent and sharing of selves, your own examples perhaps that you may have experienced, because either using your own examples or talking about others that you've worked with who have been successful gives people that expectation that it will be a positive outcome. You certainly want to show examples of people that were successful, not people who had who were not able to meet whatever the goals were in the therapy. They also interestingly point out, this is in Self and Practice by Michelle Baldwin. She talks about, this idea that Buddhism has an interesting perspective too, and that all we can be assured with in life is change. And many of us have difficulties with change based on control or other issues. So that's an element that's present as well. And the important thing is how you begin your relationship with your client. That's the key thing, is the person-centered foundation starts first before moving into the therapeutic work with whatever techniques or methods you may use. The art of therapy is the foundation of the common core factors, and the science has to do with the evidence-based kinds of materials that we train on and will use in practice. David Keith, who's in one of the last chapters of Michelle Baldwin's book, made this statement about psychotherapy, which I think is quite wise. He said, good psychotherapy produces destabilization and changes that are not just cognitive adjustments, but whole person changes. So again, we're dealing with changes. See, change seems to be a theme here in a lot of what we do. And Virginia Satir used to ask people, how do you feel a lot? Some people got kind of tired of that, but Satir's focus was, we've got to have people deal with what's going on in the here and now, what's going on. And I think this nicely dovetails into Rosenberg's nonviolent communication, which has to do with helping people work through anger. And what he says is, if people are yelling and screaming at you out of anger, they're calling for help, which I thought was an interesting perspective. But essentially what he does is he has people describe the situation without judging what happened to them, in other words, their experience, and then beginning to look at what needs they were having that were not being met. What were the unmet needs that were sparking this anger? And then to talk about the feelings and coming to a place where they would ask, would you be willing to do something in regard to the situation with the person or persons that they may have been involved with. This involves some further training, but I suggest that Rosenberg's nonviolent communication would really be helpful in terms of our practice, in terms of getting people to communicate with each other. So that's kind of our intro here in terms of looking at what's going on. Next, I'd like to share with you some of my own use of self in practice examples, which were earlier on. I was in vocational rehab before I became a licensed therapist, and I had completed a guidance and counseling degree, a master's level degree, sometime before that. And in the mental health unit, I chose to take on a mental health caseload because I wanted to understand mental illness and what people's experiences of various diagnostic labels were, because we tend to label people, and I think sometimes that can be problematic, because when we label, some people just are lazy and go with the previous label. And that comes to kind of an issue of what I had in terms of my bias. We're talking about biases. I used to initially read people's records that were given to me, and they were very biased records. Not only I was becoming biased, but the people who wrote them were biased. And so it was interesting to see what kinds of diagnostic menus I found in people's charts. I mean, sometimes I found conflicting diagnoses. And so what I finally decided to do was don't read the record before I meet the client. And so my practice was to just meet the person and have them tell their life story to me and however they felt comfortable. Then begin to see how and that way we were able to step into their view of the world. Because remember, in trauma-informed care, it's not what's wrong with Mary, it's what happened to Mary, what was her experience of what was going on. Hearing that, I think, is very important. And some of my clients, I don't think ever had anyone listen to their story before. It was really interesting to hear their feedback about that. But then so that's that's one bias we may acquire in practice that we don't have right now. If well, you've got a lot of experience, but I mean, someone that may be coming in new, we may find that we're biased by other things, like others' biases from other people that they read. So I found that sometimes what I would arrive at in terms of a diagnosis was totally unrelated to what I saw in the listing. And we need to be careful about this because people are labeled for life. And I think going to the least serious diagnosis based on what the DSM offers us to choose from makes more sense. And so making sure that those criteria that are required for the diagnosis are discretely met for each diagnosis that you would render. And so the listening to the stories was really important because not only when clients tell their story, you're hearing it, but they're hearing it. And hearing yourself tell your story from the client perspective, I think is a very powerful part of the practice of healing. And I think they've been doing that early on in terms of Freud and other people around people with PTSD rather kinds of issues. So, and then of course, narrative therapy has one be able to change the story as an example. And that I think is also important. And then looking at another example in terms of the use of metaphor in artwork, you're going to see on a screen here 3 images, which I call Mandela symbols. At the beginning, I was working with an intern at UCF at an AIDS service organization in Orlando back around around 1990 something early. And she and I had talked about this idea of forgiveness because we kind of came to the idea that some people have issues of forgiveness that block them from moving forward. So with some of her clients, she was asking them if there was anyone they wanted to work on forgiveness with. And this middle-aged, or kind of 30th to 35 to 40-year-old wanted to work on forgiveness of his father. And so we began this kind of, I have an article on the stages of forgiveness in therapy. And in stage 3 or 4, when you're kind of into session 4 or so, you would have them write a letter, an unsent letter to the person they wanted to forgive. And so in this case, he was to write a letter to his father, and the next week there was going to be this Gestalt-like exercise where he reads the letter and engages in the process. So in the interim week, the father called him. He hadn't talked to him in about 20 years, out of the blue. I don't know where he got his phone number. He calls and says, "Son, I have terminal liver cancer and I'm supposed to die within the next year. I'd like you to come home and take over the farm." I think I may have mentioned this a little earlier, but I wanted to show you the mandala images as well that he showed. Well, anyway, he and his father reconciled during that phone conversation. He obviously wasn't going to go home and take care of the farm. However, this was this was what I call therapeutic synchronicity or extra therapeutic factors that happen along when we're working with individuals that we couldn't possibly predict. It was a very meaningful coincidence that he was able to reconcile with his father and that he had intended to work through this. Thank goodness that they didn't have to do the Gestalt exercise the following week because that had been well taken care of. But these images you see up here, what happened was in his adolescence, you'll see the picture with the horse in front of the house. She had him do the pictures, and I said to her, I said, "This looks to me like something happened in the past," because you'll see where the direction the horse is facing, which essentially is the past. I said, "Why don't you ask him when you come back next week what happened here?" Because there was a cloud over the house and there were other things. By the way, this is my rendition of his artwork and not his original artwork because he kept it. But basically, I've got the symbols here. So the horse you see is something I took off the internet because I'm a stick figure person and the horse wouldn't look like one. But anyway, the important aspect here is that he wanted to become an equestrian competitor, Olympic equestrian competitor. And when he told that to his father, he said, "You can't even ride a horse. What are you talking about?" And crushed his dream. See, I'm really big about not crushing our clients' dreams or family members, but to try to do something other. So this was really kind of a lifelong thing that got stuck there. And then, of course, when he came out to the family that he was gay, he lived in the Midwest. That was a really negative thing. And he eventually moved to Florida because of that. And so in the middle picture, which is the one you see with him on like a skateboard going through the picture and out of the circle, that was kind of as he talked about his life. It was very up and down and rough. He had a very difficult life. And now he's at the AIDS Service Organization because of his diagnosis. And in the last slide, or the last mandala, he shows him standing there with the sun, the moon, and some other images. And it's sort of his current existential angst. What is life about? And how can I incorporate that? And so those were issues they were working around. But the critical thing for him at that point was he needed to first forgive his father and deal with his issues in terms of self-forgiveness around those kinds of elements that came through that relationship. Very powerful, but note your extra therapeutic stories that the clients tell you, because this synchronicity issue, therapeutic synchronicity is what I call it, because you incorporate that in your practice and it's very healing. And sometimes it can jump 5 sessions ahead, and you might have been able to eliminate several of the other steps that we had in the forgiveness process because he actually did it in midstream. So I think that's an important example. And then the last one that I'll mention is my secretarial support person in Voc Rehab. Of course, I worked with several therapists who would refer people to VR, and then we would work together with them. And so there were several transgender individuals who had been referred to my caseload, and this was a 50-year-old man who had just begun the transition and called and said, I'm transgender, and would it be okay if I wear a dress and a pearl necklace to my interview? And I said, that would be fine with me. I said, I don't have any problem with that. So he arrives to the office and he's in the waiting room. And of course, unfortunately, in this office, we had a public address system. So Doris, my secretary, decided to announce his arrival and said something to the effect, George, a man with a dress wearing pearls is waiting to see you in the waiting room. I thought, oh my God, now I have to kind of do, damage control in terms of what Doris just did. And Doris was a church-going person, but certainly wasn't aware of her biases. And a lot of times I say this because we may be trying to attend to our own biases in some ways, but then we're working around other people who also have biases, and sometimes their biases can affect our work with clients that have been marginalized in our society. So I think sometimes when we do our work, we have other outside kinds of issues coming in that impose on us around issues of biases, as an example. Moving to the idea here of the use of rituals with interns and clients, one example for the intern would be listening to one's intuition before the session, where one taps into intention to have a positive outcome and stepping into the client's worldview. That would be kind of a ritual one would do as they walk toward the session each time or sit down before they log in. So that's an example, and there are ones we can do with our clients. Now I think what we'll do is move into the area of the use of self in practice from the materials we've done today. And so what you'll see now on the screen between myself and Dr. Bucky is the client-centered elements we've talked about. So I'm not going to go into great detail with some of these, but I want you to look at these from the lens of the use of self in practice. So the use of self in psychotherapy, this idea that client-centered focus is critical for the alliance to be built, and advanced listening skills are really critical here because the client feels that they've been listened to. That really builds the therapeutic alliance with the client. And the common core factors that need to be involved with this, which we've looked at before, Dr. Bucky will talk a little bit about them here again. Since we've had a lot of detail on them, she's just going to go over a review of them. But think of yourself in terms of using these in your practice if you aren't currently already doing it.
Correct. And especially if you're supervising interns, which of course is why you're in this course in the beginning, um, the presence of being genuine to any client with whom we engage is, in my opinion, essential. And the literature certainly supports that. I think many clients have worked with several intervention specialists, whether they carry the title of person in the counseling center in a certain setting, whether they carry the title of psychotherapist. And I think many clients, because they have had some experience prior to us and engaging with us, have learned perhaps to put up their radar and to see really who we are. So the idea of coming into the session with a client who may be across from you or beside you and just being a human being to that client, listening carefully, acutely to what the client is saying, and attempting to engage them in a conversation as a very genuine person who is expressing some interest in who they are and what they have to tell you. So, our congruence, I think, is a beginning point that leads us then into that infamous saying that comes from Rogers, unconditional positive regard. George has already alluded to a series of elements and biases that also form prejudgments. And I love the idea too, George, of not reading about the client before you engage with them because of the potential for biases by the former recorder, if nothing else. So as we go into that, giving the client our full attention, unconditional positive regard, which means we take in what they say and what they share without judgment and without their seeing that we are being judgmental, raising our eyebrows or pulling back from them, whatever. And I often say to students, in fact, that clients are very much like adolescents. They can smell a rat a mile away, and they can really tell if you are not being genuine and if you're not interested, if you're just going through the motions, which I think that understanding nature then emits from us if we truly are engaged with them. And consequently, it opens us up to what we say and how we approach the client as saying, come, let's collaborate, let's come together and work on issues, problems, distresses that you may have had that brought you into this arrangement today with me. And together, we will do this. And I do believe that so many of the clients that I have worked with in my social work history have actually had people dash their hopes and engage them in a fear mongering almost to allow them to question themselves, who they are and what they can do. George has already given some examples. So there always must be an element of hope that we engage our clients with and that we leave them with until the next session.
Next, we now again we're looking at these from a couple lenses because this is about the supervisor's use of self in practice, but also modeling this is for the intern. So this is kind of like this parallel process. It's always at play when we're discussing this. But trauma-informed care again, and we've talked about this. You know what it is, but how have you done that in your practice that you might share with the intern? So this is kind of the sharing and teaching element of what you do. And again, we talked about hearing the client's story, but also the client hearing the client's story. And we've talked about the alliance in terms of the common core factors. And this idea of using intuition as before you begin, the antecedent to what the supervisor or intern may do before the session, I think is helpful because it really sets a positive direction, but it also gets us thinking kind of along where the client's coming from, as we used to say. And then incorporating the therapeutic synchronicity. I gave a couple examples of that. And again, therapeutic rituals that people may develop with a client as you go through. I found that using the SRS and ORS was helpful because it punctuated the beginnings and endings of session, which is kind of, in a sense, a structure that people become used to as you go through the time working with the intern, but also the intern working with clients. And then, of course, the extra therapeutic factors are in addition to just meaningful coincidences that may happen for the client, like promotions or other things that maybe not directly related to therapy. And then always staying focused on holistic practice with body, mind, and spirit kind of connections. Because when we're in a session with a client, we're both in the here and now, and we're also in non-local areas in terms of where we go in our thinking and self-messages and listening, this knowing sense that we have, which is about intuition as well. We use a lot of things in session that we may not give a lot of thought to. So at this point, I think we'll move then to evidence-based practice, which is the next area that we talked about. So what we looked at in client-centered area was the art of the profession, and now we're looking at the science and evidence-based practice. And so here you'll see on the image, we have the therapeutic methods and techniques that you use, which you're very familiar with, and this idea of managed care's impositions on what we are able to do or not do in terms of the guidelines. So that sometimes is a challenge, both in terms of us with the client, but also as time has gone on, there's been a reduction in terms of reimbursement from insurances. I've talked with some private practitioners that now have to see at least half as many more clients to stay at the same income they were at, say 6 or 7 years ago. So not only is the managed abuse affecting the client, but it's also affecting practitioners. And that's a challenge, I think, as we go forward. How do you, use of self, how do you manage around that sort of playing field as well? And then feedback informed treatment. And Dr. Bucky, would you like to talk a little bit about that and an example you have?
George is so gracious. Actually, I asked to talk about this because I think it's so critical to what you do, both as your own practitioner in your own setting, as well as a supervisor with interns. And I come at it, the story I'm about to share with you and the elements in it, from the position of someone who was an intern and who was engaging with a supervisor. And granted, this was before I learned anything about feedback informed treatment, but it also goes to show, I think, how critical the supervisory relationship is for an intern. And a particular series of group sessions with the supervisor that four of us shared in an agency. I was always seeking something more genuine, something with more feeling and empathy and instruction in it from my supervisor. She would engage at a superficial level, I felt. And then we had some general information, but nothing really that could hone us into someone who could deal with a particular issue with a client the next time and the next time and the next time. In other words, I did not feel there was an opportunity to grow my learned skills that I was acquiring from, especially from the group sessions, but also from the individual sessions. Now, whether that had anything to do with my accepting an invitation to go off and get a PhD, I don't know, but I do rather think that it was an impact statement of sort for me to head toward higher knowledge. And who knows, had it been different, a different experience for me, I might be sitting here with LCSW after my name as well. But I just wanted to emphasize how strongly I feel about the ability of you as a supervisor to be a role model, to be a leader, but to also give an opportunity to your interns to engage with you in a very proactive way so that they can move forward, widen their experiences, and solidify their knowledge base to gain more confidence. And of course, that's what they're working toward as a licensed clinician. Thanks, George, for that opportunity.
Next, deliberate practice. We've talked a lot about deliberate practice for supervisors and interns, but in this case, I'd like to talk about how the intern may do deliberate practice with the client, which would be various things around role plays. So then moving then to assessment of intern competencies. Competencies is another area that we might want to be more attentive to, and I'm providing you with some materials, but you may use your own. I mean, I don't know, I couldn't find much out there, but looking at how do you take the knowledge that people have and develop the skills, which is a deliberate practice piece, and then their abilities to do that and reflect on it, which is kind of Paulo Freire's educational process. You take the knowledge, you apply it, and then you reflect on how successful or how it went, which is really kind of what we do as supervisors with interns. Then developing therapeutic boundaries, most important. And by developing the boundaries and beginning to share but not share too much with the client, we begin to also offset our, as we were saying earlier, our transference issues as well. and also building more empathy toward the client if we can share with them issues that we may have overcome that might be associated within reason. And so that's another judgment thing, but it's important. Then managing the parallel process, we've already been through that in some detail, and risk management, attending to your needs in terms of self and risk management, always being attentive to when you're doing things and what the rationale is. And if you're ever sitting in a courtroom and they're asking you, well, why did you do this with so-and-so? How might you respond in terms of providing the evidence of what supports that? And then I think formative and summative evaluation is also important. I do more with this in the 12-hour workshop, but as you're getting through meeting the various competencies, that would be kind of your formative evaluations, where you move from that to the next stretch goals. The summative evaluations are more your annual or every 6 months, depending on how frequently you do those. So that would be that area that I would just kind of quickly cover now. And then moving finally to other factors that we are facing in our work. I like this concept of therapist as wounded healer. This is an interesting concept, but I think it's very important because all of us through life are somehow wounded on a number of levels. And I even think there's a scripture, I believe it's in Luke's gospel, where there's something about physician heal thyself. It's an interesting kind of thought that's stuck with me for years. But see, we don't heal our clients, we help facilitate them healing themselves. And I think that being a wounded healer, we also examine how we've been able to heal through various ways that we can help the client. Basically, we look at the client and try to figure out how best we might help them deal with these issues. How might they hear them? What might we have them do? I'm really a big advocate for artwork. You know, I studied mandala symbolism for a while and how it's used in diagnosis. I didn't use it exactly that way because I'm more into metaphors, and I think the metaphors that come in artwork are much deeper than talk therapy and lead sometimes to uncover things that may have been missed over several weeks of talking. So I encourage you to involve the clients in a useful way with artwork and your use of self in practice in whatever way you're able to do so. I also have a student that I work with that does gaming. He was working with adolescents and children and also adults in a substance abuse program. And they just love this sphere that he had, that you had to get things around this thing to get it into the space where it didn't fall off the track. The adults in the group couldn't wait to do that every week when they got together, which was interesting. But he also told me about card games and other things he used with students who had short tempers. And they would address the issues around the temper in the game as the person became frustrated. It was interesting, but he was doing gaming in therapy, which is a growing thing as well. Both his were card games and games within the session as opposed to online kinds of things, but there are elements of both that are being used as an example. Then looking at your role as supervisor, you know, educator, advocate, leader, those are also elements of what we do in our supervision with the interns. Of course, the self-care plan we've talked about. And then awareness of our own personal biases, values, beliefs, limitations, and needs, as well as having the intern become aware of those in context with their therapeutic work. And of course, in the end, trying to figure out what the balance is in terms of how much self-disclosure. If the client is having to do all this exposure, it's helpful if we kind of work with them with some examples. I think it brings them to some sort of sense that you're also a real human. And it also helps us become more sensitized that none of us is perfect in this world. And it helps build some compassion for people, particularly around groups that we may have a historical bias with. But I think once we look at people as individuals and humans and try to step into their world, it helps us do some shifting into that direction. And with this, Julia, do you have anything further to add before we close?
I just want to say that I do have the utmost respect for those of you who are supervisors, because you have a tremendous amount of responsibility coupled with the weightiness of that liability factor we've spoken of earlier. But I think the most precious thing you bring and you can ever deliver are the engaged, sensitive, sharing, and competent future clinicians that you are molding as a supervisor. I think that is one of the most phenomenal gifts you can give the world at this time. I've often been amazed at George what I have been able to learn about feedback informed practice. And so I hope that you will embrace some, if not all, of those elements to give interns, like this person once was, an opportunity to both track their needs and their growth simultaneously. And of course, modeling that behavior for your interns is essential as the final touch to those clinicians that you are producing. Thank you so much for your work.
Now we will move to the next objective in the CE.
Here in Objective 8, we're going to discuss business aspects of supervision, and there are many. Here in this table, we're looking at some very basic functions and activities of the business side of your job as supervisor. And perhaps you are a supervisor within an agency, or perhaps you're a supervisor in your own agency. But either way, these areas overlap and sometimes they occur in multitudes and greater numbers. Sometimes you can go one by one, and then all at once, there's a need for many occurring concurrently. So everything from legal to actuarial and accounting, you may do consulting, of course, always administration, becoming accredited, financially solvent, and even for expansions to justify your level of income and trustworthiness, how you store records and complying with statutes accordingly, your skills and computer skills set as you both deliver services as well as account for your business. And finally, the security of your entire team. And these are only some of the functions and activities that we're going to be looking at, but now we will shift to some very specific ones, starting with the Business Associates Agreement.
The Business Associates Agreement is part of the HIPAA-compliant elements of the platforms we use. A person that performs certain functions or activities that involve the use of disclosure of protected health information on behalf of or provides services to a covered entity. This outlines the responsibilities and risks of business associates, or what they assume in terms of their work, serves as legal contract that outlines HIPAA requirement to follow. And when signing up for a platform, you need to sign the Business Associate Agreement in order to conduct business. I use the Doxy.me site, and I immediately went to that part of the site to sign the BAA, so that began to immediately protect me in terms of my work on the platform. You've all been doing this already for some time, so my guess is everybody signed a BAA, but if you're new to this or beginning to work online, that's something you want to make sure you do first before ensuing into the practice part of this. Business aspects of supervision. Curiously, in the graduate training I had in social work, nothing came up in terms of courses or discussion about the private practice and the business aspects of what we do. And a lot of people have had to wing this over the years, but I'm happy now to see that this is a focus, at least of what we're talking about in the training. Shields noted that the education of psychotherapists is focused on skills of psychotherapy while ignoring discussion of business of doing psychotherapy. And so, we have a lot of the legal implications of malpractice and suit and all of those issues, but there are a lot of other kinds of business elements that we need to be concerned about. And many psychotherapists are reluctant business people. I know I didn't go into private practice because I was kind of concerned about doing that. And I've only done a small bit of private practice since I've retired because of that. When fees are modified during the course of therapy, Pasternak suggests the therapist should be aware of possible transference and countertransference elements in the therapeutic process. And also, we are aware in the last year that the law has been passed where we have to project what it will cost a client who comes to us for therapy. We have to give them a list of what the individual sessions are and what our guesstimate is in terms of how many sessions and what that will cost to the client if they decide to enter into the therapeutic relationship. We must inform the client of the terms of service, as it says, including the fees and regard to how we will deal with appointments that have been canceled. As Pasternak would say, psychotherapy training needs to include learning, awareness of fee setting, and collection of many learning skills and techniques of psychotherapy. There's also a reference to an article here that covers a bit of this discussion as well. And then HIPAA compliance. HIPAA compliant privacy rules are national standards regarding how to disclose rights and the use of protected health information and under what circumstances. This protects most identifiable protective health information held or transmitted by covered entity and its business associate in any form, electronic, paper, or oral, directs reasonable steps taken to secure PHI, and privacy rules exceptions, written consent of the client to have someone else be shared the information that you're going to transmit. Usually that's to another health provider. Protects from clear imminent risk of serious mental or physical harm to prevent a serious threat to public safety. That's like the mandated reporter discussion that we've had in different trainings over time. When clients bring public charges against the licensee, report abuse or neglect exploitation, another mandated reporter area, and report or consult with colleagues or supervisors who share responsibility. Along with this PHI disclosure, it's very important that we keep records in our offices, if we're in an office with others, in a place where people don't see them. In other words, people who are the cleaning crew should not be able to come in and see records, because that would be a violation of the protection of the protected health information, having probing eyes look at things that should not be available. So things need to be locked up and protected as part of this, just as a thought with someone I've talked about who had a problem with this in the past. And then the security rules again, national standards protecting individuals' electronic PHI that is produced, received, used, or maintained by a covered entity, making sure we use the encrypted emails and text materials we use to protect health information. Requires organizations to manage comprehensive and accurate assessment of possible risks and weaknesses associated with the confidentiality, integrity, availability of electronic protected health information held by the entity, and requires suitable administrative, physical, and technical safeguards to endure. This also suggests that you would have a protocol set up in your practice into how you would deal with these issues.
Now we're going to look briefly at some aspects of malpractice, your direct liability as a supervisor. Direct liability can result from the actions of the supervisor which cause harm. Vicarious liability are those situations in which the supervisor is held liable for the actions of the intern, even when these actions were not suggested or known by the supervisor. To me personally, that's a very heavy lift for supervisors to be responsible for the actions of an intern, even when you had nothing really to do with those actions. All the more reason to set aside what we have just finished discussing, which is that initial session, that learning curve, the knowledge curve that develops between you and your intern, so that hopefully you need not ever experience any vicarious liability suits or even alleged actions. So how can we reduce our liability risk? Here are some keys that we have found both in the legal as well as the statutory literature. Many of you may attend trainings held by certain agencies or providers, or even the NASW Assurance has begun doing a series of trainings on reducing your liability risk. First is what we just alluded to, the trusting relationship that you have developed with the persons that you supervise. Secondly, keeping up to date on those legal issues. There are several ways, especially in our laws and rules course, that we introduce you to doing your own searches between that course mandate time, and being able to be aware by board edicts and board notifications, by visiting external sites, and by, of course, you're having access to your own attorney should one be needed. We cannot emphasize enough carrying adequate liability insurance for you and any practitioners that may not have their own insurance who are practicing under your umbrella. And finally, making sure that that supervisee carries their liability insurance, especially in the indications that would be profound. One, that supervisee might change jobs, whereas they might have had coverage in one job, they may not in a subsequent employer. So primarily, we want you to keep your risk as low as possible. And in attending a couple of courses, I've always been impressed by the following scenario I'm going to describe to you. And that to me has become almost a standard of care for you, the practitioner. And that is to imagine that someone has charged you or filed a suit against you for some infraction in your practice. It could be minor, it could be major, and you must defend yourself. And to imagine that the challenger to you has opportunity to display over on the side of a room all of your file entries, all of your detailed reports that they have been able to acquire through a court order. How defensible are your actions and those reports to an objective body? That image stayed with me. And it is something that we want to caution you to do everything within your power to protect, because your liability risk determines your practitioner capability. George, do you have anything to say or add to this area of liability and protecting your liability risk?
I think you covered it pretty well. The only thing that I always caution people about is the extent to which they may be using text messages to clients. I would keep that to be very limited, maybe to appointments or something, but certainly not any discussion of what's going on in your therapeutic work with the client, just as a concern. And emails, be extremely careful in terms of what kinds of emails you're sending to clients. I was expert witness on a case some years ago, and the emails were going to be so used against her in terms of that discussion with the client. Be very succinct in what you're using emails with as well, and make sure that your emails are encrypted, that you meet that standard for HIPAA.
Excellent, excellent additions, especially from the expert witness point of view. So now we're moving to objective number 9, where we will discuss the ethical, legal, and regulatory issues of teletherapy. George, would you like to lead on this slide, please?
Right. As you see here to the left, it's a lot of red tape in terms of moving into this era. Some of you are probably doing teletherapy before COVID, but certainly now a lot more of us have been using this as a method of working with clients. And I think screen-to-screen exchanges are effective in terms of our work. And so we have here some issues. I'll read quickly through these 4 columns. I know I don't like reading slides, but it's pertinent to what our discussion is here. This idea of licensure and malpractice, being exceedingly careful here if you're doing interstate therapy, that you're licensed in the state where you're doing the therapy. In other words, where the client is located. If they're in Iowa or in Idaho or Washington State, you need to make sure that your ability to provide services in that state are legally covered in terms of your licensure. Now, there's a lot of reciprocity that's beginning to take place, but right now there isn't a lot of this going on. So be very careful about where you're doing therapy if it's outside of the state of Florida. And then looking at scope of practice in terms of what you normally would do in the way of practice, you want to make sure that you're somehow trained in doing teletherapy, since that's part of your practice now. That's a different element than face-to-face work. And informed consent's extremely important. And when you log in each time, we'll look at a slide a little later, checking in with the client to make sure that nobody is present that's going to hear the discussion. I know some time ago I had a person that preferred to meet with me in the car in a parking lot. There may be other things, but you want to make sure that the confidentiality element is always present. And then, of course, billing and reimbursement information. A lot of the sites now allow you to bill at the end of the session, or if you have a biller, but how do you deal with that? What are you going to do about billing and reimbursement? And then procedures and protocols. These are really important. Developing what roles and responsibilities are for the therapist and the client in your practice, quality improvement in terms of not only your system that you're using in terms of connecting with the client, but also improving your own practice and skills. Deliberate practice perhaps might be something that one might engage in around some new skills that one is trying to learn in kind of a consultant basis with someone else. Patient provider ID, emergency protocols. What happens if there was an accident on the other side of the connection? Who would you contact? That's why when you log in with people, you need to know what the emergency numbers are in that location and who one might contact if something were to happen, particularly if you have issues with persons that may be thinking of self-harm. What would you do about that? These are part of your protocols and procedures that you have already set up before the incident perhaps may happen. And then what sort of clinical settings are provided in terms of the screen to screen? Are you in an office? Are you at home? Are you in your own office? Where are you at in terms of where you're placed in terms of client, but also where is the client in terms of protection as well, in terms of the therapy that you're doing. And under technical considerations, platform requirements, integration into other systems, if you have such an opportunity. I only have my computer and DoxyMe here in my home location office. Physical location and room requirements, also needing to know the physical location of where the client is during the session that you're currently involved with. And also contingencies. What happens is there's an internet glitch and you lose contact? What do you do to recontact the client during that session period? I know when this first happened, when COVID came on, when this first happened, I had a client where things crashed. So what we did is we picked up and finished the session via the telephone as an example. But what were your plans? Are you going to do a connect by telephone to figure out how you're further going to complete the session? Will you try to reconnect by computer? Having these laid out ahead of time and the client is aware of this makes things a lot less stressful, especially if clients aren't comfortable with technology to begin with. And then clinical considerations, patient and setting selection. Is the car appropriate for some people? It may not be. What is appropriate and how can that be arranged on the client's part so that your sessions can be conducted without being interrupted? Management of patient-provider relationships. Again, developing the therapeutic alliances we talked about in the face-to-face is always a different challenge when you're online, but certainly very doable. And then engaging in understanding ethical issues. And part of that may be a mandated reporter. You want to be clear about what you have to report when people may share information with you or other issues that may be involved. Cultural issues, as we talked about, cultural awareness and biases that may be present between you and the client or the client and you. And specific populations, again, that awareness of cultural issues and concerns of populations, for instance, the disabled community or people who are in the hearing impaired community, and visual as well. There's being careful in your internet material that the material is large enough for people to read the words. Those are concerns that one might have as well.
This slide content is simply some ways that you can check and cross-check the information that you may need, superimposing that table prior to with this one and the remaining part of this particular objective. For private practitioners who have their own website and or if you are a federal contractor, you need to be aware of two particular acts listed here. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973 regarding the accessibility of IT, and secondly, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 that's enforced by DOJ. This actually subsumes two primary components. Public entities require and mandate accommodations, and those are included and extended to any internet or web-based provider. Secondly, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines was passed by Congress and enacted in January of 2018. This is, as George just alluded to, concerning people with visual or auditory disabilities. If we're using photos, graphics, high content modes of distribution of information to those persons with particular disabilities, we must ensure through the Web Content Guidelines that those can be seen and heard and appreciated in their full spectrum by the recipient. There is a link below here on this slide where you can check your web accessibility based on these guidelines, and feel free to click it and follow the instructions there. And finally, Florida Statute 456.47 actually directs all healthcare providers on the use of telehealth to provide services. There is a payment parity that was actually signed mandating physicians to participate, and those rules for participation that included fees, and that was actually vetoed in a subsequent House bill. So that is just but one example here in Florida of how the payment structure can be guided and now regulated by the state of Florida on providers within its boundaries. Next, we're going to look at a table that we hope will be useful, that will subsume the check-in elements of any telehealth session. George, would you like to carry forth some of these, and I can pick up at the end with comments?
Yes, the VAPP was Julia's development of this slide, which I really like: video, audio protection, and privacy. So basically here under the video, and this is checking in, by the way, when you're online, can you see me, in terms of making sure that, sometimes we're below the screen, so our mouth may not be, or our chin may be resting on the screen. So being aware when you put up your computer where you're located in space, and the client as well, you want to be able to see the client's face. Can you hear me? Those kinds of questions. So adjusting the screen or adjusting the audio or clarity during the session is important so that both individuals can hear what's going on and see. And then in terms of protection, you want the client's current location, including address and room. Determine how you'll reconnect if disconnected, as we talked about a little earlier. So having a phone number or text ability to connect back to figure how to connect and continue the session. And then the phone for emergency services, local 911 system or other. Obviously, if you call 911 where you're located, it's local and it's not where the person's located. So being more specific about where and what you will call. In other words, what agency or who would be the person or persons that would be responding to the need. Privacy: is anyone else present in the room or the car or wherever the person's located? Can anyone else hear us talking? That's the important questions we were alluding to earlier. So encouraging client privacy in terms of where you hold your meetings with them, and record any changes to clients' emergency information since the last session. So it's very important to keep current with the client's information. Some people are concerned about actually meeting with the client who say they're the client. In other words, would someone come on and be an imposter to do therapy with you and not the person who you think they are that gave you the insurance number? So being able to ferret out or figure out who actually you're meeting with is another challenge, I think, in some of the online situations that we may get into.
We know that the state board has mandated practitioners under the 491 board in particular to look at the evaluation of a particular client for the suitability of online services in telehealth and telemental health. So here we're looking at some of the information that's taken from Stoll and his colleagues regarding the ethical arguments in favor of online or screen to screen, as George commonly uses it, psychotherapy. So this listing is for your exploration and review. We've highlighted several of the ones that particularly resonated with us based on what we have heard from other clinicians, such as yourself, and from what we have experienced on our own, especially George's experience with his private clients and my experience with students accessing clients via telehealth. So we're looking at number one, an economic advantage is certainly present in online. If we think about setting an appointment, leaving work, getting permission to leave work, traveling 15 minutes, or perhaps if you're here in Orlando with us, you're on I-4, you may be traveling an hour to get to a session with a therapist, spending your 45, 55 minutes getting back in the car, going back to work or back to another setting. This can involve hours previously when many people were meeting only face to face. But now through screen time, we check out, we use 5 minutes to check in. The therapist clears us using the table or other information that they had, and bingo, we're ready to go. So the whole concept of economic advantages extends from access to the session itself, from lowering travel cost, especially today with higher rising cost on all fronts, and being economically accessible to persons who might otherwise not have access to therapy and actually need that therapy. They may not have transportation access. They may not have the wherewithal to connect and reach out for help. So the economic advantages are multiple and they are extensive today. Anonymity and privacy can certainly go both ways with online connection, but here we're looking at things that favor it. Many people say they would much rather meet online because they don't have a great deal of in-depth knowledge about personal parameters for either the therapist or the clients. Also, we're able to cross borders of all sorts, as long as George referenced earlier. We're licensed in the places where the client may be. So we can cross borders and we can continue ongoing therapy regardless of where the client and the therapist are located. And finally, just looking at some other informational items in the far right, it's a certain freedom for therapists as well as for the client. It is a certain diminishing of intimacy, but some people prefer it over face to face because it's intimate but short termed and not limiting as far as information exchange. So these are some of the arguments in favor of online psychotherapy. And now we're going to look at some of those against.
Ethical arguments against online psychotherapy. You'll note that there's some duplication from the favor and against, so there's like two sides to the same sword or something. But before we discuss the five that I've selected to discuss here, I want to point to the article at the bottom. This has been added to the Clinical Supervision Resources website at gjacinto.org. It's along with the templates we talked about earlier, but the website has a number of resources and some articles associated with some of the slides we've talked about. But this one I particularly put up because it's a new area of practice, and I like that this is a narrative review of the literature. That is helpful because they've looked at a number of things associated with for and against discussions. So here we have therapist competence and training. Again, having to do with competence in the use of online therapy. There are a number of wonderful workshops available for us to do that, and there's certification associated with some of them. But it's important to have the sense of all of the things around the issue of telehealth that's important. And, we've looked at some of the safety issues here, but there's a range of them. And that's an important thing to keep in mind and keep updated on because things continue to change. Then, of course, technology competence, both of the therapist and the client. Many clients may not have ever used online connecting before, particularly on such things as like Doxy.me or other platforms. So helping them along the way is also helpful. to both the therapist and the client and the intern and the supervisor. So that's an area that began for a lot of people around COVID, and helping walk the clients from face to face to technology. I think many of you have done that, and that was helpful to kind of walk through it to help people become more comfortable. And then again, practicing across borders, the issue of telehealth and licensure we've talked about already during this workshop. And then boundary issues. There's a lot of boundary issues that we're aware of in face-to-face, but also in terms of screen-to-screen kind of work. And also they're allowing now that we can do phone therapy, which used to be not allowed, at least as this period of the COVID-19 continues in terms of the law. The boundary issues online, do you give them your phone number and are they able to call you? Or how do you deal with being able to connect perhaps between sessions if there's a need to do so? You have to figure that out in terms of your protocol, but you certainly don't want to have the phone ringing all hours of the day. So limiting somehow the connection with a person who's remotely located from where you're positioned. And then the comparability to face-to-face therapy. People tend to prefer face-to-face therapy, many, and have gone back to face-to-face therapy since COVID has remitted a bit, although there seems to be a new resurgence again in the summer and fall of 2022. And then patient dependence and loss of control in terms of patients. So that patient dependence issue is around the boundary issues I think we need to be sensitive to. I'm not sure if you've encountered this particular issue, but it's potentially looming there on the horizon for many of us. And the loss of control of the, I'm not sure what Stollmuller and Transel was doing with loss of control on this line. I know the patient dependence stuff, but for further information, these other elements are also included in the article and its discussion. So I would encourage you to go to the clinical supervision resources area where I have articles listed at the bottom of the web page.
And George, I think too, we've often discussed, you and I, that it takes some time to develop a certain level of comfort and engagement in your presence on an online platform. And I would encourage you to be patient, both with yourselves and certainly if you are now experienced at telemental health delivery, you're going to convey that to your intern. You're going to give them much reinforcement, reassurance. And that, of course, is something that's going to come from your modeled behavior. But if you're uncomfortable, then certainly continue to, as we're saying to everyone, practice, 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 because it really does improve. And likewise, our platforms are improving as well.
And I'd like to also throw in my emphasis on intuition in teletherapy work. But, trying to visualize the person before beginning the session as you're logging in and setting the intention for positive outcome and begin to sense where the client's worldview is and how that may be operating as you work with the client in the current session.
And with that in mind, we're going to close out our discussion with you. We're going to share some comments, thoughts, and concerns reflecting back on the course.
We really want to thank you for joining us for this particular course, the 4-hour supervision course. And in so doing, we are mandated by the board to provide certain competencies for you, certain objectives that are listed by the board we have covered in what we hope is sufficient detail for you. But we need to hear back from you to see if we hit the mark for you out there. You are the final consumer. And so in order for us to know if we're doing a good job for you, we need to hear from you. And if you want changes, please let us know. George, would you like to just go over exactly what resources are available to them?
Yes. We both have websites that are cited here throughout the CE. And on the workshop on ggcenter.org, the page that I've put up, and I'm going to be expanding on that over time, but what's there currently, when you log in, you're first going to come upon competency worksheets. I'm developing competency tools, and so I have to change the ones that are there now because I've since changed them. But you'll first come upon those because that's kind of the last thing I've done. And then you'll come on to Word documents using templates that we show as we've gone through the course, followed by PDFs from other organizations like in Australia and Santa Clara County, California. I've produced copies of a number of their templates and their websites, because you can find more on the website. I just gave you a flavor of what's available there, followed by some tests and measurements that you might want to consider using or may have access to. For instance, some burnout scales, a suicide scale that we talk about. We both did a lengthy suicide prevention workshop, and we took the Columbia training to administer their suicide assessment scale. And then trauma screening tools are the last grouping there, like the ACEs, as we've talked about, and some of the others. So there's like 3 or 4 to give you some things to look at in terms of where you probably are using these, but if not, here are some examples. And I believe I have copies of those in that. I did a menu, and then I think as you go through, you might find them listed or provided there. And then a number of articles associated with the CE. So articles we've referenced in the CE, not all of them, but key ones will be also provided. And then we've put up our supervision videos. Now, these videos, or today's videos, will be going up now, but we had done some previous ones which were rather lengthy. We're not using them in the 12-hour and the 4-hour at this point, but I'm leaving them up just for your information. If you have insomnia, this will fix it. And so moving forward, I'll let Dr. Bucky continue along our list of things we want to say. Oh, by the way, before that, I just want to make a disclaimer. In the initial discussion, I said that our order was different than the board's order, but we actually did, looking at this at the end, we're following the order in which the laws and rules list in their documents in terms of the order in which we present the material. I just wanted to clarify that because that was a misunderstanding at first. Okay.
Because, George, we really are doing what we promised to do. We're taking in feedback from our first exposure of the 4-hour course earlier in this spring in 2022. And now we're infusing much of that request for change or clarity back into the rendition that you have just completed for this course. And as such, as George reminded you, and I want to do so again, in your notebooks, you will be seeing all of the references on each slide that we have done, and we provide that for you in a repetitive fashion, so you don't have to go looking around for things when you need them. However, if you're a bibliography or a reference list person, you have that with this course too. And you also have the housing address for obtaining the materials for this course here in the course itself. And it's a link, and it will be emphasized in your references that you will receive as well as a part of your notebook component. So again, we're looking for your feedback, and we want to know if you would be interested in sharing our other courses, but also in a brainchild that George has had cooking now for about a year. George, do you want to tell them about it?
Yes, we've talked about having a certificate program for qualified supervisors in terms of offering additional material that can't be contained in the 12 or the 4-hour workshops. One of them is to look at this idea of competencies. That will be about a 2-hour workshop that we've been talking about that will be the first that we offer. And then there's some elements around business in terms of how to set up a practice and in terms of that element of what the business part of it is. We may do this ourselves or have someone who we respect in terms of their work provide with us this material. And then I think what's important now, though, is when we get your feedback, if there are workshops you think are needed that expand on what we've been talking about, it would be helpful to figure out what people are looking for in terms of if they want to become certified as a qualified supervisor. What would you want to further have knowledge, skills, and abilities around. And so we really warmly encourage your sharing with us what other things might need to be in a program that would offer a certificate. Also, the 12-hour workshop for the initial 12-hour, we are redoing that one as well from earlier this year. And by spring, we'll be offering both of these, both online, and in some cases, we'll be doing a mental health workshops around the 4-hour and 12-hour as well.
So we have left for you on this slide some key information elements, those links that we just mentioned to both websites and an email address for respectively each of us. So please do let us hear from you. And when you go on the Your Choices website, you will see a sampling of other courses that George has already listed for you that we have done, and you will be able to link to those courses. Eventually, you won't have to go very far because we're going to have them all housed in one place for you. So again, please let us hear from you. Message us, call us, write us, send us an email, whatever you need to do. And we'll be glad to take your concerns under consideration, and your comments certainly will be pointedly used and applied. That is our promise to you as being our clients too. So thank you very much again for joining us. George, I'll leave it with you for your closing remarks.
Well, one closing thought is that the notebooks that you have from this workshop, feel free to copy whatever you might want out of it to share with your interns or in your practice. This is all available for you to use however you might want to, but I think it provides you with a booklet of materials that you could use or refer back to. But I encourage you to share them with your interns if you feel you'd like to do so. That will continue to help expand their understandings and practice without you having to reconstruct the wheel. Again, I've thoroughly enjoyed being here today, and I hope you've had a good experience with the continuing ed hours. Thank you.
Thank you.